I'd like to welcome you to the Chill and Heal Show. My name is Steve Richard. I'm going to be hosting the program today. And Alderman Chrissy Cantor is at the Republican National Convention, and she sends her love and warmest wishes to everybody here in Manchester. And so today we have a very special program. There are some decisions that have recently happened at the U.S. Supreme Court that is going to have a significant impact in all of us here in the United States, and of course trickling down to those of us that live in the beautiful state of New Hampshire. And regardless of your political affiliation, I think it's really important that everybody understand what these decisions and the ramifications of those decisions, how they're going to impact us here in New Hampshire. And so I've got a very special guest with me today. He is a New Hampshire constitutional scholar. He is a veteran. He also and has proudly served, and he's also carries the same last name as me, because he's my cousin. And so I'd like to welcome Daniel Richard to the program.
Thank you for having me today.
Awesome.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So Dan, I'm just going to start with, I introduced you as a New Hampshire constitutional scholar, an expert.
Yes.
And some people might say, well, what makes him an expert in the New Hampshire Constitution? Could you just take a few minutes and just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. The use of the word scholar, if you look up the word scholar, it means someone who studies a subject matter. And the big difference between someone like myself who studied the law and a lawyer, for example, I recently made the following quote, which is, lawyers go to law school to study the practice of law. I studied the law.
Right.
And that's the big difference. So I'm more of a historian, so all of my studies have been predicated on using the same rules that the courts apply in examining how our government functions, because there is a long list of precedent in place that guides how the courts examine the acts of our legislature and discern whether in fact the legislature has acted within the scope of its enumerated powers. But that's how I apply the law and how I've come to understand it. The other thing is I've spent almost 15 years of my life studying the law.
Right. Not
the practice of law, because I didn't want to be a lawyer. I didn't set out to do that. I set out to understand what are my personal responsibilities, because self-government or self-governance requires all of us to be involved in some level. And so many of us who have awoken in the last few years have all discovered that, there's a lot of people who've been showing up in our place, and they've done so because the American population is too apathetic to handle their own responsibilities. So they let other people fill their shoes, and now they've woken up to a government and a form of government here in the United States that they don't recognize.
And so I think, and some people may hear that and go, well, that's nice, Dan.
Right.
However, I know that you've had the former Attorney General of the state invite you up. Could you just take a moment as kind of proof or validation for people watching?
Sure. Two specific areas. Former Secretary of State Bill Gardner, who had been in the post here in New Hampshire for almost 50 years, 45 years, I guess, and started in 1973. I became friends with him during my research, and I went to him. He had an open door policy, and on many occasions he could not believe that someone knew as much about our laws and our function of our government as I did. And so at one point in one of our meetings, he stopped me and he paid me a very flattering comment that he's given me permission to repeat, which is he told the state reps that were with me, he said, Dan, gentlemen, this guy Dan knows more about our history and our laws and our Constitution than the judges, than the lawyers, than anyone I've ever met.
For the state of New Hampshire.
For the state of New Hampshire specifically. And then he went on to invite me to teach constitutional law to him and his legal team. And the reason he took notice of this is that I've read every election law the state legislature has ever read or ever written going back to prior to the Revolutionary War. Most people have not done that. And I do everything backwards. I start with the original source.
Right.
And so as I came to know more about the study of law, I came to understand that this is exactly what the courts do. They look at the plain original text and its historical application. And we'll talk about that as to how the Supreme Court's decisions recently are reaffirming all of my positions. The other thing from what I've accomplished as far as credibility, I've argued, or hopefully successfully, I've argued before the New Hampshire Supreme Court twice.
Yeah.
And many lawyers never do that.
Yeah.
They never get there. And you don't get to argue before the Supreme Court unless you do two things. One, normally have a novel case. In other words, a case that they've not heard before. And so if they don't have existing precedent, then they're going to want to hear it.
Yes.
They're going to want to hear this new legal challenge to an existing problem. The other thing is they want to make sure that there's no existing precedent that is on the books that allows them to simply rule on the matter on appeal, because our state Supreme Court is an appellate court. It's not a trial court. So everything that goes there is a case that's on appeal because it went through the lower court.
Right.
And so those are two of my big accomplishments now, to have argued before the state Supreme Court. And anyone who wants to see those arguments, and I'll let your audience be the judge as to how well of a job I did versus the state lawyers. Those two cases, by the way, are 2022-0325. You can go to the state Supreme Court live archive feed, check on that year 2023 for the first time, and last November, which was 2023-0097. So I'm the last oral arguments of the year.
Well, I'll just say that I have watched both of them, and I watched you, and you're not an attorney.
Right.
Yet you know the law, the New Hampshire law, better than anybody I know. And I guess we would invite you to be your own judge. But from my perspective, I was thoroughly impressed because you had a handle on the law, and they...
And the state did not.
And the state did not. I'll just kind of put it that way. The state did not. And so, and in one of those, I know there were two attorneys on one side, and you handled yourself incredibly well in front of the New Hampshire Supreme Court. All right, so that being said, we've kind of laid the foundation and hopefully kind of established your knowledge and your position on this topic, which is very, very deep. There have been some recent decisions that have come down from the U.S. Supreme Court.
Yes, absolutely. They're very important decisions. But before we go there, I'd like to start from the very beginning so that your audience has a grasp of what's happening.
That would be wonderful.
So the first thing that everyone needs to understand is, what form of government do we have? You're constantly told in the media that we're a democracy. We're a democracy. Donald Trump is going to destroy the democracy, or Joe is going to destroy the democracy if he doesn't step aside. So these pundits continue to use the wrong word. So
on purpose.
On purpose, by design, to mislead the viewers to think about a different form of government that we in fact don't have.
That's right.
So let me explain to your audience what the difference is between, for example, Canada and England versus the United States.
Yes.
Canada and England are socialist democracies where the people themselves are subjects to their sovereign powers, which is the monarch, the King of England.
Right.
So when the King of England delegated some of his power through the 700 years prior to the Revolutionary War, we end up with the English Parliament. So Canada has a parliament as well.
Yes, they do.
And so in that type of government, that back and forth of who's going to establish the laws of the land that govern everyone that lives in the land, right,
Yes.
in the realm of England. So when this all got created, the people gave that power, that sovereign authority, to the Parliament. And so this is what ultimately led to the Revolutionary War. So the Parliament would do as it pleases because it was sovereign. So under that form of government, the consequences was the Stamp Act.
So they gave the power away to a group of people
Who were supposed to act in their best interest.
And of course they didn't.
They didn't.
Okay, thank you.
Human nature is what it is, right?
Once you have power, you don't want to give it back.
That's exactly right. So it led to all of the abuses that the Revolutionary War was predicated on.
Yes.
So we're looking at the same problem today. So now the United States became a completely different type of government for the following reasons. The people that landed here, the first two settlements in the United States were Jamestown, the Jamestown settlement in 1620, and that was a charter from the King of England that gave them passage to land in the New World.
Yes.
The second charter was actually a recommission to send another boat, the Mayflower, to Jamestown too, but they couldn't get there.
Yeah.
So they end up in Plymouth, Massachusetts. So we know that as Plymouth Rock. So that set the first two colonial governments. Now those governments were, again, far from the motherland across the Atlantic Ocean. And they started to practice what was called, what they understood for 700 years, which is English common law, based on the Bible, right?
Yes.
Based on the Ten Commandments as the moral code of the society.
Right.
And so they then, without the same strict oversight they had in England, they started to free themselves of some of the abusive practices. For example, the practice of their faith, being compelled into the conflict between the Protestant and Catholic that confrontation was a big part of what they were running away from.
Yeah.
They didn't want to be ignorant of the scriptures and have a human being be the in-between between the scriptures and God.
Right.
And that's what the church was using to abuse the people of England. And that's what they were fleeing from. So they started a different way of government. And so by the time the Declaration of Independence happens, we have 150 years of American common law, not English common law. Now let me explain what that means. Common law is often referred to is, again, the evolution of usage and customs from the Ten Commandments, but through generations are passed from one generation to the next. So at home, you learn the fundamental scriptures, the law, right, was this Bible, followed by the usage and custom. The usage and custom produced judicial decisions. And those judicial decisions, often referred to as stare decisis, which is Latin for case precedent, would be referred to as common law.
Can I just pause you for 1 second?
Yes.
I just want to remind the readers what we're doing right now is we're talking about the how the media and some politicians are pushing that we're a democracy. We're just doing a quick little education and how we're not actually a democracy,
Right.
and how we came to a constitutional republic.
Exactly, exactly. So that put in place this process of English common law. Now, everything changes during the Revolution. This brand new experiment where the people will now be sovereign and the king will no longer be sovereign.
So the people actually they're sovereign, which means they have their own rights.
Right, exactly, that their power is derived from the book of Genesis, from the scriptures.
Right.
So this is where they derived their power and said, look, our unalienable rights are derived from our maker, not from a man, not from the king.
Right.
So this was a radical shift that had never been done before. And for your audience, I want you to understand that New Hampshire plays a pivotal role in this whole process for the following two reasons. New Hampshire was the first of the 13 colonies to declare its independence by drafting a constitution on January 5th, 1776.
So just to be clear, the first one.
The first one. It was the first written form of government that was seceding from the king. And if you read that document, it's available in multiple locations online. I love Avalon Laws, one of my great research tools. It's Yale Law School, and they have all the important archive documents, as well as Cornell Law. And so a lot of these law schools have extensive online libraries. That's how I self-taught myself much of this stuff, because it was available online.
Right.
And so this put in motion the first of the colonial entities to say, hey, king, we're done with you, and here's our reasons why. And we would, in fact, consider reconciliation if you could, in fact, cure these issues. And what were they, Steve? The right to petition the king, the right to protest his acts, remonstrate, right? That's what the word remonstrance means.
Right.
To protest the acts of Parliament. And that's what Parliament was doing. It was refusing to hear the cries and the abuses of these abusive practices, of these abusive taxes.
So
right?
when you shove things down on the people had no way to
fix the
push
problem.
back and fix the problem, and this is what they were asking for.
And history,
State of New Hampshire.
Yeah, and so what you look at from the whole evolution in England is that the 1100 Charter of Liberties, it was the first written form of government where the king and the king acted like a king, and the people said, hey, you can't do this anymore.
Yeah.
So he made them promises. So 100 years goes by, and they said, hey, this is where Magna Carta comes from, 1215, in the year 1215. And so the locals grab him, put a sword to his throat, and said, hey, that written contract that said you wouldn't do these despotic things to us in the future, well, you're doing them.
Right.
So here's our law. And they forced him to sign what we ultimately now know as Magna Carta. And so each of these events always leads to someone getting their head cut off. Okay? So sequentially in England, when the people are deprived of their right to relieve the stress created by a bad government,
Yes.
it always leads to this type of bloody conflict.
Yeah. That's actually what the Second Amendment's all about. It has nothing to do with hunting.
Right, exactly, exactly. So that's the backstory, folks.
Yes.
So now let's get to New Hampshire, the beginning of New Hampshire. Our first Constitution was highly defective. It was but one body. It was one chamber. They met at Exeter earlier in that fall. They sent delegates to the Continental Congress to see what the other colonists were doing in the other states. And they said, yeah, go ahead and write a constitution. But again, they were trying something that hadn't been done before. So they wrote this very defective document that didn't have separation of powers. It had no way to change the document itself, and it did not obtain the consent of all the people living in the land of New Hampshire.
Right.
The northern part of the state on horseback, or the western part of the state, was several days or maybe a week plus to get there by horseback.
Right.
So they were not consulted, nor did they give their consent.
Right.
So this creates a lot of, and so the Revolutionary War really stresses this defective government that now makes the rules. And so those colonists, by the way, they got together, the men of wealth. They had spent 150 years securing all this wealth. See, the king had a great racket. He stole the land from the Indians, gave it to his own countrymen, and got perpetual revenue. It was a great gig if you can get it, right? But so
Didn't help the people one bit.
No, no. But those men had what? Secured for their families what they perceived as perpetual land ownership and wealth by coming here and settling the land, right?
Right, right.
And so this is what they had going on. But again, the king acted like a king. The parliament did what they did. So this new form of government, the other defect is that there was no separation of powers. So this same body,
One body.
they made the law. They sat in judgment of their own law, and they enforced their own law. The
Yikes.
very definition of tyranny.
Yes.
So, but the thing is that they had to get through the revolution because their bigger concern was the king's militia, his navy, and his mercenaries had now landed here. Now there's a war to fight.
Right.
So we get to the other side of this. Now, meanwhile, there's
That
all
got
these...
put on the back burner for until after the
Exactly.
Revolutionary War. Yeah.
But all the other states followed suit. So New Hampshire was first, Virginia was second before the Declaration of Independence, and after that we go from there to all the other 11 states after that also wrote state constitutions during the war.
Yeah.
When the war came to an end, the Treaty of Paris, 1873, in the fall of 1783 in September, we now had the king. Remember, I always tell people the Declaration of Independence was a divorce letter.
Right.
It was, we're done with you, here are the reasons why, and we're now on our own.
Right.
And so the confirmation of that is the Treaty of Paris, in my opinion, because the king then surrendered any and all claims he had on the colonies, the land,
Right.
the fisheries, which is current political topic. But anyway, this is how it all comes to be. And the unique thing that New Hampshire had going for it is that when it gets to the end of this, it has the good fortune to look at all of the other 12 constitutions written by other famous founding fathers.
Right.
And what New Hampshire did is said, hey, we like this, we like this, we like this, but we don't like that. And they took John Adams' work, the Massachusetts Constitution from 1780 as a template. So anyone who studies this, like I do, if you become a geek and you go down the road and educate yourself on this, you'll find that they're almost identical.
Right.
And so the courts, by the way, look with great importance on precedent from Massachusetts courts.
Yes, because we're very similar.
Exactly. So that same text, so that original intent still equally applies.
Right.
So that's the layout. That's how we came to be a government. Now here's
And what kind of government are we?
a constitutional republic
Which means?
that the people preserve or reserve unto themselves the power to authorize more government,
And how many bodies?
and with three powers of government. So let's walk you through that. So knowing all of this, this is where New Hampshire becomes first in the world.
Yes.
What they did, knowing the defects of the first document, they then had a convention. They had 3 constitutional conventions before 1783. And in 1781, they met in convention, and then they sent their proposed form of government out to all the communities in the state. And this is where the representative form of government comes to be. And the people said, no, we don't like this. There's no Bill of Rights. See, the English form of government had a Bill of Rights from their time in England, right? So, but that's another history lesson. So they said, we don't like this. So they sent it back in 1782. They had another convention. Well, we don't like the governor. We want a president of New Hampshire. And so we don't like this, so they sent it back to the people. And the people made some changes, and their representatives went back to Concord, and the third constitutional convention in New Hampshire then was agreed upon. And it put in place this constitutional form of government, that all power is derived from the consent of the governed. And that's what the first article in the Bill of Rights of New Hampshire establishes, that all government of right originates from the people, and most importantly, the last sentence of that document that says this document may only be changed through the consent of the people. Only the people have the authority, because let's go back to the first sentence. All government of right, not some, all government of right originates from the people. And my great historical example of this is in the year 1850. The state legislature only possesses the power to propose changes to the government, because they're just our agents, they're just our employees.
That's right.
They can't.
They're supposed to work for us.
Exactly. So they can't redefine. Imagine you open a company, you write a manual for how you would hire your employees, and then you hire all those employees, and the first thing those new employees do is rewrite the manual as to how they re-elect new employees or rehire. So
they'd stay there forever.
that's exactly what they're trying to do. So yeah, this is what gets put in motion, and so yeah, this is how New Hampshire, the constitutional republic here becomes. And then, of course, 4 years later, they send our representatives go to the famous Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, where the Articles of Confederation, which was the compact that the states were operating under prior to to get through the Revolutionary War.
Yes.
The new document was the U.S. Constitution, and so all the delegates brought that document back from Philadelphia and submitted it to their state legislatures, and that's how we became the United States of America as a constitutional republic, not a national central democracy. By the way, that's what some of the people were trying to do. James Madison was one of those people. James Madison actually proposed the Virginia Plan in that convention, where he wanted a sovereign parliament. He wanted a sovereign entity. And the people said no. One of my favorite quotes from that convention is Mr. Patterson, the representative from New Jersey, who rises in the convention in opposition to what is being proposed by Madison's surrogate. He says, "Dear sir, you're asking me to commit treason against my commission. My commission from New Jersey does not authorize me to surrender the sovereignty of the state of New Jersey." Where's that today? So yeah, that's the whole setup.
So
that's
Dan,
how we get to be here.
Can I just, and I know we've got a few more minutes here, but I want to go back to something, because I think it's the foundation of understanding what's going to be our next TV program that we do together, because there's some things, I think this foundation has been incredibly important. But you said at the very end, regarding the state of New Hampshire Constitution, that the power lies with the people.
That's right.
How?
How? 3 ways. You are given 3 ways in order to correct your government. The first one is the ballot box, right? That's the way the people exercise their sovereign power, is to change their government when necessary through the election process.
Okay.
Number 2, you have a constitutional right to petition your government for redress of grievances.
Yes.
You have the right to assemble in your community. That's what all these beautiful town halls throughout the state are all about. They would meet in the town hall, voice their grievances to their representative, who would ride on horseback to Concord and represent their interests. So that's how that began. So that's Article 32. So you can ask the legislature to do something it has the authority to do for you, or ask them to repeal a law that they had no business passing in the first place. That's another lesson for another day. And the last and final way that you can exercise your authority is the courts of law. The courts of law, judicial scrutiny. And this is where all these cases lead to this fact, that whenever you pass legislation, right, and this is where the courts come into play, it is their job to examine whether the legislature acted within the scope of the powers the people gave to them. And I'll close out with this really simple story from 1850. The legislature proposed 12 changes to the state constitution. Here's 5 of them. Repeal the executive council. Number 2, create a office of lieutenant governor. Number 3, create a department of agriculture. Number 4, create a department of railroad. Number 5, create a department of education. The people woke up the next morning and found that the people said, no, we're not giving you more power, because that's the only way state government can grow. And that's what these recent decisions, once we get into that at the next time we have the sit down,
Yes.
we'll get into how these cases are going to impact that moving forward, because it's going to be a big deal.
Yes. Well, I think this has been an incredible conversation, and I think we were going to talk a little bit about the decisions of the U.S. Recent decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court. However, I think this foundational understanding is incredibly important for everybody watching, because the way the New Hampshire Constitution is set up is that we do have the power. Unfortunately, I would say many of us, to most of us, don't understand our own Constitution. And so part of what we want to do is educate people as to the power that they do have. And then that will lead to our next show, which will be, we'll talk about the recent decisions from the U.S. Supreme Court and the many areas of impact that is bringing not just to the United States, but to the state of New Hampshire, and how that may relate to one of the court cases that you have at the New Hampshire Supreme Court right now.
Right.
So
that's the basis of my case in totality,
Yes.
which is that the state went around the process required to change the Constitution because you can't change how the employees reelect themselves.
That's right.
And that's the basis of my
That's
case.
the heart of the whole thing. So on behalf of the Chill and Heal Show, I'm Steve Richard. I'd like to thank you for watching, and until next time, we'll see you soon.